The blood on the fence post was still fresh when Xavier Whitmore rode up to the ranch just outside Independence, Missouri. His bay horse snorting uneasily at the scent of violence hanging in the July air of 1878. He had been tracking unusual movement through this territory for 3 days now, and what he found made his jaw tighten with anger. Dead elk, stripped of their hides and antlers, littered the northern boundary of what he knew to be the Thornhill property, their carcasses left to rot in the summer heat. Poachers had been working this land, and from the looks of things, they had been at it for weeks. Xavier dismounted, his boots hitting the dusty ground with a soft thud. At 26, he had seen his share of trouble in these parts, working as a ranch hand and occasional deputy when the law needed extra help. His father had taught him to respect the land and the animals on it, and what he was seeing now went against everything he believed in. These were not men hunting for food or survival. These were men driven by greed, killing for profit and leaving destruction in their wake. He was examining the tracks when he heard the sound of a horse approaching at speed. Xavier's hand moved instinctively to the revolver at his hip, but he relaxed slightly when he saw it was a woman, riding hard across the open prairie toward him. Even from a distance, he could see the distress in her posture, the way she urged her paint horse faster. As she drew closer, Xavier found himself staring despite the grim circumstances. She was beautiful in a way that seemed to belong to this wild land, with dark auburn hair that had come loose from its pins and green eyes that blazed with fury and fear. "Who are you and what are you doing on my property?" she demanded as she pulled her horse to a stop, dust rising around them both. Her voice shook slightly, though whether from anger or exhaustion, Xavier could not tell. "Name's Xavier Whitmore, madam. I've been tracking poachers through this territory. Looks like they've been hitting your land pretty hard." He gestured to the carnage around them, keeping his tone respectful but direct. "I'm guessing you're Miss Thornhill, Mrs. Thornhill," she corrected sharply, then seemed to deflate slightly. "Though I'm a widow. My husband died 2 years ago. It's just been me and my ranch hands trying to keep this place running." She dismounted with practiced ease, and Xavier noticed the rifle in her saddle holster. "Mara Thornhill, and yes, I know about the poachers. They've cost me thousands in lost game and scared off the natural herds that my cattle depend on for migration patterns. But it's gotten worse in the last week." Xavier studied her more carefully. She was probably around his age, maybe a year or two younger, with sun-kissed skin that spoke of long hours working outdoors. There were shadows under her eyes, and he realized she had probably been losing sleep over this situation. How much worse? Mara wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture that seemed more about holding herself together than feeling cold in the summer heat. "They've started threatening my men. 2 of my ranch hands quit last week after finding a dead coyote hung from their bunkhouse door with a note pinned to it. The note said they would end up the same way if they interfered. I'm down to 3 men now, and they're all spooked. I've been trying to patrol the property myself at night, but I can't cover all 500 acres alone. You've been riding patrol by yourself." Xavier felt his anger shift from the poachers to concern for this stubborn, brave woman. That's dangerous, especially if these men are willing to threaten people directly. "What choice do I have?" Mara's voice rose, passion and frustration bleeding through. "This ranch is all I have left. My husband bought it with dreams of building something lasting, something we could pass down to our children. He died before we could have those children, but I'll be damned if I let some criminals destroy what he worked for." Tears threatened at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. Xavier made a decision in that moment that would change both their lives, though he did not know it yet. "I'll help you." I've dealt with poachers before, and I've got experience tracking and dealing with men who think they are above the law. I can't pay you much, Mara said quietly, hope and hesitation warring in her expression. The ranch is doing well enough, but my funds are tied up in livestock and feed for the winter. I'm not asking for payment, Xavier replied, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. What they're doing is wrong, and someone needs to stop them. Besides, I've been between jobs since the Thompson Ranch sold last month. I could use the work, and you could use the help. Mara looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for something. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her because she nodded slowly. All right, Mr. Whitmore. But I need to know you're serious about this. These men are dangerous, and I won't have anyone else getting hurt on my account. Xavier, he corrected gently, and I'm serious. Let's head back to your ranch house, and you can tell me everything you know about these poachers and when they usually strike. They rode back to the main ranch together, and Xavier got his first good look at the property Mara was fighting so hard to protect. It was beautiful land, with rolling hills covered in prairie grass, a creek that ran clear and cold from the nearby springs, and groves of oak and cottonwood that provided shade and shelter. The ranch house itself was modest but well built, with a wide porch and shutters painted a cheerful blue. Outbuildings included a large barn, a bunkhouse, and various storage sheds. Everything showed signs of good maintenance despite the obvious struggles Mara had been facing. The three remaining ranch hands, weathered men in their 40s and 50s, eyed Xavier with a mixture of suspicion and hope when Mara introduced him. Their names were Dutch, Samuel, and Tom, and they had all worked for Mara's husband before his death. After hearing Xavier's credentials and his plan to help deal with the poacher problem, they seemed to relax slightly. We've seen at least 4 of them, Dutch said, leaning against the barn wall as the group gathered in the shade to talk. Maybe more. They come at night, usually around midnight or later, and they work fast. They've got a system set up, probably got a buyer somewhere who's paying top dollar for illegal hides and antlers. Any idea where they're coming from? Xavier asked, his mind already working through possibilities. There's an old mining camp about 10 miles north, Samuel offered. Been abandoned for years, but Tom and I rode up that way last week and saw signs of recent habitation. Campfire remains, horse droppings, that sort of thing. Xavier nodded, filing away the information. They're probably using it as a base. Makes sense. It's close enough to strike quickly but far enough away that casual patrols wouldn't find them. He turned to Mara, who had been listening intently. I'd like to ride out tonight and see if I can spot them in action. Get a count of how many we're dealing with and what kind of weapons they're carrying. I'm coming with you, Mara said immediately, her tone brooking no argument. Madam, I don't think, Xavier started, but she cut him off. This is my land, Xavier, my fight. I'm not sitting in the house while you risk your neck out there. Her green eyes flashed with determination. I'm a good shot. I know this property better than anyone, and I can handle myself. Besides, you'll need someone watching your back. Xavier wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she stay safe, but he recognized the steel in her voice. This was not a woman who would be easily convinced to stand aside. Fine, he said finally. But you follow my lead out there. If things go bad, you get yourself to safety. Agreed. Agreed, Mara said, though the look in her eyes suggested she had her own ideas about what constituted safety. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Xavier checked his weapons, cleaned and oiled his rifle, and made sure he had enough ammunition. Mara showed him detailed maps of her property, pointing out the areas where the poachers had been most active. They ate a simple dinner of beef stew and bread that Mara had prepared, and Xavier found himself watching her move around the kitchen, noting the efficient grace with which she worked. "Your husband was a lucky man," he said without thinking, then felt his face heat with embarrassment. Mara paused, a plate in her hands, and looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. "James was a good man," she said softly. "We had 3 years together before a horse kicked him in the chest. 3 years, and I thought we would have 50. She set the plate down and turned away, but not before Xavier saw the old grief in her eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, meaning it. "Don't be. I learned that life doesn't give us guarantees. All we can do is fight for what we have while we have it." She looked back at him, and there was something new in her gaze, something that made Xavier's heart beat faster. "Thank you for being here, Xavier, for helping me fight." As darkness fell, they prepared to ride out. The moon was nearly full, which would give them light to see by but also make them more visible if the poachers were watching. Xavier and Mara mounted their horses quietly, checked their rifles one final time, and headed out toward the northern boundary where most of the poaching activity had been concentrated. The prairie at night was a different world, full of shadows and strange sounds. Crickets sang in the grass, somewhere an owl hooted, and the wind carried the scent of wildflowers and dust. Xavier kept his senses alert, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Beside him, Mara rode with the confidence of someone who knew every inch of this land. They had been riding for about an hour, moving slowly and quietly, when Xavier held up his hand in a signal to stop. In the distance, perhaps a quarter-mile away, he could see the flicker of a small fire, too large to be a campfire but contained somehow. As they watched, figures moved around it, dark shapes against the flames. "That's them," Mara whispered, her hand tightening on her rifle. "Easy," Xavier murmured. "Let's get closer, see what we're dealing with." They dismounted and tied their horses to a small copse of trees, then moved forward on foot, using the natural dips and rises of the land for cover. As they got closer, the scene became clearer and more disturbing. 4 men were working around the fire, skinning a fresh kill, another elk from the looks of it. They worked with practiced efficiency, clearly having done this many times before. A wagon stood nearby, already partially loaded with hides and what looked like bags of antlers. "There's only 4 of them," Mara whispered in Xavier's ear, close enough that he could feel her breath on his neck. "We could take them." "Maybe," Xavier agreed, studying the scene carefully. "But they're armed and they've got cover with that wagon. If we rush them, someone could get hurt." As if to prove his point, one of the poachers straightened up and stretched, and Xavier saw the rifle strapped to his back and the pistol at his hip. These were not amateurs. They were prepared for trouble. "So what do we do?" Mara asked, frustration evident in her whisper. Xavier thought quickly. "We need to know who they're selling to. If we can cut off their buyer, we cut off their reason for being here." He gestured to the wagon. "Once they've loaded up, they'll have to take that somewhere. We follow them, find out where they're delivering, and then we can hit them and their buyer at the same time." "That could take all night," Mara protested. "Better than a gunfight where people die," Xavier countered. "Trust me on this." Mara was silent for a moment, then nodded. "All right." "We follow them." They retreated back to their horses and waited, watching from a safe distance as the poachers finished their grisly work. It was nearly 2 in the morning before the men finally doused the fire, hitched their horses to the wagon, and started moving. Xavier and Mara followed at a careful distance, using the moonlight to track the wagon's progress across the prairie. The trail led north, just as Samuel had suspected, toward the old mining camp. But instead of stopping there, the wagon kept going, following an old trail that wound through increasingly rough terrain. Xavier began to worry that they had been spotted, and this was some kind of trap. but the poachers ahead showed no signs of concern, talking and even laughing among themselves. Dawn was breaking, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold when the wagon finally reached its destination. It was not the mining camp, but rather a large, prosperous-looking ranch tucked into a valley. Xavier felt his stomach sink as he recognized the brand on the gate posts. The Walking J Ranch, owned by Jack Johnson, one of the wealthiest ranchers in the territory. Johnson was considered a pillar of the community, a man who donated to churches and served on the town council. No, Mara breathed beside him, clearly recognizing the place as well. Not Johnson. He's supposed to be respectable. Money makes people do terrible things, Xavier said grimly, watching as the wagon rolled up to a large warehouse building and was greeted by a well-dressed man who could only be Johnson himself. They watched from a rocky outcropping as the poachers unloaded their illegal cargo, Johnson examining the hides and antlers with obvious satisfaction. Money changed hands, lots of it from the looks of the thick envelope Johnson handed over. The poachers laughed and clapped each other on the back, clearly pleased with their payment. "We need proof," Xavier said, his mind racing. "If we go to the law with just our word against Johnson's, he'll bury us. He's got money and influence." "So we get proof," Mara said, her voice hard with anger. "That warehouse must be full of illegal hides. If we could get in there, take some samples, maybe photograph the evidence somehow, that's dangerous," Xavier warned, but he was already thinking through the logistics. "Johnson's got hands working this ranch security. We'd need a distraction." "I'll create the distraction," Mara said immediately. "I'll ride up to the main house, say my horse threw a shoe and I need help. While they're focused on me, you get into that warehouse." "Absolutely not," Xavier said firmly. "If Johnson is willing to hire poachers and deal in illegal goods, he won't hesitate to hurt you if he suspects anything." "He won't suspect me. I'm just a widow with a lame horse." Mara's eyes blazed with determination. "Xavier, this is our chance. We have to take it." Looking into those green eyes, seeing the fierce courage there, Xavier realized he was falling in love with this woman. The realization hit him like a physical blow, leaving him momentarily speechless. Somewhere between her stubborn refusal to give up her ranch and her willingness to ride into danger to protect what was hers, she had captured something in him he thought had died long ago. "If anything happens to you," he started, his voice rough with emotion. "Nothing will happen," Mara interrupted, placing her hand over his. The touch sent electricity through him. "But I need to know you'll be there, that you'll have my back." "Always," Xavier promised, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. "But Mara, when this is done, we need to talk. About more than just poachers and ranches." She looked at him, surprise and something else, something warm and hopeful flickering in her expression. "I'd like that," she said softly. They made their plan quickly. Mara would wait an hour, giving Xavier time to position himself near the warehouse. Then she would ride in with her manufactured crisis. Xavier would use the distraction to get into the warehouse, gather evidence, and get out before anyone was the wiser. Xavier worked his way down from the outcropping, using every bit of cover the landscape provided. The Walking J was busy with the morning routine, ranch hands moving between buildings, starting their daily chores. He managed to reach the back of the warehouse without being spotted, finding a window that had been left slightly ajar. He was just working it open when he heard the sound of hooves and Mara's voice calling out for help. She was a better actress than he had given her credit for. Her voice carried the perfect note of distress, and through a crack in the warehouse wall, he could see hands and even Johnson himself moving toward her. Xavier used the moment to slip through the window, dropping down into the dim interior of the warehouse. What he found inside made his blood run cold. Rows and rows of illegal hides, antlers stacked like cordwood, even some furs that he recognized as belonging to animals that were supposed to be protected by territorial law. This was not just about poaching on Mara's land. This was a massive operation, probably spanning multiple properties. Johnson had been doing this for years. Xavier quickly gathered samples, cutting small pieces from various hides and tucking them into his saddlebag, which he had brought with him. He was just about to leave when he heard voices approaching the warehouse. Johnson and one of his men, talking in low, urgent tones. "I don't care if she seems innocent," Johnson was saying. "I don't believe in coincidences. A woman shows up here the same morning we take a delivery. Check her saddlebags, search her if you have to. If she's a spy—" Xavier did not wait to hear the rest. He moved quickly to the window, but it was on the wrong side now. The voices were coming from the direction he needed to go. His heart pounded as he realized Mara was in danger. Johnson suspected her, and if he found anything suspicious, there was no telling what he might do. Making a split-second decision, Xavier kicked open the warehouse door and stepped out, his rifle leveled at Johnson and the three men who had Mara surrounded by her horse. "Step away from her," he said, his voice cold and hard. "Now." Johnson's face twisted with rage and recognition. "You're Whitmore, aren't you? I heard you were tracking poachers in the area. Should have known you would stick your nose where it doesn't belong." "Interesting that you knew poachers were being tracked," Xavier observed, keeping his rifle steady. "A law-abiding citizen would have been happy to help catch criminals. But you're not law-abiding, are you, Johnson? You're the one buying the illegal kills, funding the whole operation." "You can't prove anything," Johnson said, but his eyes darted nervously. "I've got samples from your warehouse. Illegal hides, protected species. That's all the proof the territorial marshal will need." Xavier took a step forward, and the men around Mara shifted nervously. "Now let her go and we'll ride out of here. Fight us, and I promise you'll regret it." "There's 4 of us and 2 of you," one of Johnson's men said, but his voice lacked conviction. "And I'm a crack shot who's taken down men at 200 yards, Xavier replied calmly. "I can drop at least 3 of you before you even get your guns up. The question is, are you willing to die for Johnson's greed?" The men looked at each other, then at Johnson, who was sweating now despite the cool morning air. Mara used the moment of distraction to pull her own rifle from her saddle holster, leveling it at Johnson himself. "I suggest you listen to him," she said, her voice steady despite the danger. "I've already lost too much to men like you. I won't hesitate to end this right now." For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. Then Johnson slowly raised his hands. "Fine. Take your evidence and go, but this isn't over. I've got lawyers' influence. You think anyone will believe you over me?" "They'll believe the evidence," Xavier said. "And they'll believe the territorial marshal when he sees what you've been doing. It's over, Johnson." Xavier and Mara backed toward their horses, keeping their weapons trained on the men until they were mounted and moving. Only when they were clear of the ranch did they lower their guns and let out the breaths they had been holding. "That was too close," Mara said, her voice shaking slightly now that the adrenaline was fading. "I thought they were going to shoot you." "I wasn't going to let them hurt you," Xavier said fiercely, reaching over to take her hand. "Mara, I meant what I said before. We need to talk." "I know," she said, squeezing his hand. "But first, let's get this evidence to the marshal. Let's finish this." They rode hard back toward Independence, pushing their horses as fast as they dared. The territorial marshal's office was in town, and they reached it by mid-afternoon, dusty, exhausted, and carrying proof of one of the biggest illegal operations in the region. Marshal Henry Garrett was a grizzled veteran of the frontier, a man who had seen every kind of crime and criminal imaginable. He listened to their story with growing concern, examining the evidence Xavier had gathered with a trained eye. When they finished, he sat back in his chair and let out a low whistle. "Jack Johnson," he said, shaking his head. "I knew he was making too much money too fast, but I never had proof. This changes everything." He looked at Xavier and Mara with new respect. "You two did good work here." "Dangerous work, but good. I'll ride out to the Walking J with a full posse, shut down his operation, and arrest everyone involved." "What about my ranch?" Mara asked. "Those poachers know where I live." "If Johnson gets word out before you arrest him, I'll send deputies to watch your place," Garrett assured her. "And I'll move fast. Johnson won't have time to retaliate." He stood, already reaching for his coat and badge. "Go home, get some rest, you've earned it." They left the marshal's office and stood together on the wooden sidewalk, the afternoon sun warm on their faces. Around them, Independence bustled with life, people going about their business, unaware of the drama that had just unfolded. "I'll make sure this ends tonight," Xavier said quietly, more to himself than to Mara. "Johnson and his men will be behind bars by morning, and your ranch will be safe." Mara looked up at him, and in the daylight he could see every detail of her face, the freckles across her nose, the gold flecks in her green eyes, the strength in the set of her jaw. "You already made sure it ended," she said softly. "You believed me when I told you about the poachers. You helped me when you had no reason to. You risked your life for my land, my dream." She paused, seeming to gather courage. "Xavier, I don't know what happens next, but I know I don't want you to leave. These past few days, having you there, fighting beside me, it's made me feel alive again in a way I haven't since James died." Xavier's heart soared. "Mara, I've been trying to find the words since this morning. I'm falling in love with you. Maybe I already have fallen. I know it's fast, I know we barely know each other, but I can't deny what I feel." "Then don't," Mara said, stepping closer. "Don't deny it. I feel it too, Xavier. Like something that was broken inside me is finally healing." She reached up, touching his face gently. "Stay. Not just to help with the ranch, but stay because you want to be with me, because we could build something together." Xavier pulled her into his arms, holding her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling her heart beat against his chest. "I'll stay," he promised. "For as long as you'll have me." They rode back to the ranch together as the sun began to set, painting the prairie in shades of orange and purple. The three ranch hands were relieved to hear that the marshal was taking action, that the nightmare of the poachers would soon be over. That night, Xavier and Mara sat together on the porch of the ranch house, watching the stars come out, talking about everything and nothing, learning each other's stories. Mara told him about growing up in St. Louis, the daughter of a shopkeeper, and how she had met James at a dance when she was 19. How they had married within 6 months and headed west to build their dream. How his death had shattered her, but also forced her to become stronger than she ever thought possible. Xavier shared his own history, growing up on a small ranch in Kansas, losing his mother to fever when he was 12, learning everything he knew about horses and cattle and the land from his father. How his father had died 5 years ago, leaving him adrift, working from ranch to ranch, never quite finding a place to belong. "Until now," he said, taking her hand. "This feels right, Mara, being here with you. It feels like coming home." "It is home," she said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "For both of us now." The next morning brought news from town. Marshal Garrett had indeed moved swiftly. Johnson and his men had been arrested, the warehouse seized, and the poachers had been caught trying to flee the territory. The operation was broken, and the evidence was so overwhelming that even Johnson's expensive lawyers could not save him. He would face trial and almost certain imprisonment. Over the following weeks, Xavier settled into life on the ranch. He proved to be an invaluable asset, his knowledge of cattle and horses complementing Mara's own expertise. The ranch began to thrive in ways it had not even under James's management, with both of them working together, making decisions as partners. The other ranch hands noticed the change, the way Xavier and Mara looked at each other, the unspoken communication that developed between them. It was Dutch who finally said what everyone was thinking, one evening 3 months after the incident with the Poachers. "When are you two going to make it official?" he asked bluntly, looking between Xavier and Mara as they all sat around the dinner table. "Because if there's going to be a wedding, I need time to get my good suit pressed." Mara blushed deeply, but Xavier laughed. "I've been waiting for the right moment," he admitted, then turned to Mara with a serious expression. "But maybe Dutch is right. Maybe I've been overthinking it." He stood and walked around the table, kneeling beside Mara's chair. "Mara Thornhill, I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person. You're strong and brave and beautiful, and every day with you is a gift. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Mara's face, but she was smiling. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, Xavier, I'll marry you." The wedding took place on a crisp October morning, with the prairie grass turning gold and the sky a brilliant blue. Half the town turned out for the ceremony, which was held right there on the ranch, under a cottonwood tree that Mara said had been James's favorite spot. Before the ceremony, Mara had a private moment there, telling James's memory that she would always love him, but that she was ready to move forward, to live again. Reverend Thompson from the Independence Church officiated, and when he pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier kissed Mara with a tenderness that made several of the ladies in attendance dab at their eyes with handkerchiefs. The celebration lasted well into the night, with music and dancing and more food than anyone could eat. As the moon rose and the guests began to depart, Xavier and Mara stood together on their porch, watching the last wagons roll away. "Mrs. Whitmore," Xavier said, testing out the name. "How does that sound?" "Perfect," Mara replied, snuggling into his embrace. "Everything about this is perfect." Their first year of marriage brought challenges and joys in equal measure. A harsh winter tested their resources and their resolve, but they weathered it together, keeping the cattle safe and the ranch running. Spring brought new calves, and the news that Mara was pregnant. Xavier was so overjoyed he picked her up and spun her around until she was laughing and dizzy. "Careful," she protested, though she was glowing with happiness. "You'll make your son dizzy before he's even born." "Or our daughter," Xavier countered, placing a gentle hand on her still flat stomach. "I don't care which, as long as you're both healthy." Their first child, a boy they named James Xavier Whitmore in honor of Mara's first husband, was born in December of 1879, during another snowstorm. Xavier paced the floor of the ranch house while the midwife attended to Mara, convinced that something would go wrong. But when he finally heard the baby's cry and was allowed into the bedroom, he found Mara exhausted but radiant, holding their son with tears of joy on her face. "He's perfect," Xavier whispered, touching the baby's tiny hand with wonder. "You're perfect. How did I get so lucky?" "We're both lucky," Mara said, looking up at him with love shining in her eyes. "We found each other when we both needed someone most." The years flowed by like the creek that ran through their property, steady and life-giving. The ranch prospered under their joint management, becoming one of the most successful in the region. They had 2 more children, a daughter named Rose in 1881 and another son named Thomas in 1884. The house rang with laughter and the chaos of family life. Xavier proved to be a devoted father, teaching his children to ride and rope, to respect the land and the animals. Mara taught them reading and arithmetic, using the small collection of books she had brought from St. Louis and adding to it whenever they traveled to town. Young James grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved the horses best. Rose was spirited and adventurous, always climbing trees and exploring. Thomas was gentle and observant, content to sit and watch the world around him. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep, Xavier and Mara would sit on their porch as they had on that first night after he had promised to stay. They would talk about the journey that had brought them together, about the Poachers and Johnson, and the fear they had overcome. "Do you ever think about how different things would have been if you hadn't ridden onto my property that day?" Mara asked one such evening when they had been married for 7 years and their lives had settled into a comfortable, loving rhythm. "Every day," Xavier admitted, pulling her close. "I think about how close I came to riding past, to deciding it wasn't my business. I think about what I would have missed you, our children, this life we've built." He kissed the top of her head. "I think about how you saved me as much as I saved you." "We saved each other," Mara corrected, tilting her face up to kiss him properly. "That's what love does, isn't it? It makes us stronger together than we ever could be apart." The ranch continued to thrive, and as their children grew, Xavier and Mara began to take on more community responsibilities. Xavier served as a deputy marshal occasionally, using his experience to help keep the territory safe. Mara became involved in efforts to establish a proper school in Independence, donating both money and time to the cause. They were respected, admired, and loved by their community. Jack Johnson, meanwhile, had been sentenced to 15 years in prison for his illegal operations. The Walking J Ranch had been sold to pay his debts and restitution to the territory. Some of his former hands found honest work on other ranches, including the Whitmore spread. Xavier and Mara believed in second chances, provided the men were willing to work hard and follow the law. As 1886 drew to a close, Xavier and Mara celebrated their 8th wedding anniversary quietly at home. Their children were old enough now to help with small chores around the ranch, and the family had developed traditions and routines that gave their lives structure and meaning. "You remember what you said to me that first night?" Mara asked, sitting by the fire with her hand in Xavier's. "After we came back from Johnson's ranch, I said I would make sure it ended tonight," Xavier recalled, smiling at the memory of his younger, more impulsive self. "I was so angry, so determined to protect you." "You did protect me," Mara said, "but more than that, you gave me hope again. You showed me that my life wasn't over, that I could love again and be loved." She squeezed his hand. "You gave me everything, Xavier." "We gave each other everything," he corrected, echoing her words from years before. "And we're not done yet. We've got years ahead of us, watching our children grow, maybe even grandchildren someday. We've got this ranch, this land we fought for, to leave as our legacy." Outside, snow had begun to fall, dusting the prairie with white. Inside, the fire crackled warmly, and the house was filled with the peaceful sounds of home children sleeping upstairs, the wind whistling softly around the eaves, the contented silence of two people who knew they were exactly where they belonged. Xavier thought back to that July morning in 1878 when he had ridden onto Mara's property and found evidence of poachers. He had been a drifter then, a man without roots or purpose. But in choosing to help her, in promising to end the threat that night, he had found something far more valuable than he could have imagined. He had found love, family, and a home that would last a lifetime. Years continued to pass in contentment and prosperity. By 1895, young James was 16 and already showing the makings of a fine rancher. Rose, at 14, had developed a talent for breeding horses and had started a small side business selling well-trained mounts to other ranches. Thomas, at 11, had surprised everyone by showing an aptitude for numbers and bookkeeping, taking over much of the ranch's accounts from his mother. Xavier, now 43, had streaks of silver in his dark hair, but he was still strong and vital, still rising early each morning to work the land he loved. Mara, at 42, had aged gracefully, her beauty now tempered with wisdom and the satisfaction of a life well lived. The small lines around her eyes came from laughter and sun, and Xavier thought she had never been more beautiful. One spring evening, with the children off visiting friends in town, Xavier and Mara found themselves alone on the porch again, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "Do you ever have regrets?" Mara asked suddenly. "About the life you could have had if you had made different choices?" Xavier considered the question seriously, as he always did when Mara asked him something important. "No," he said finally, "I don't. Every choice I made, every road I took led me to you. How could I regret that?" He turned to face her fully. "You and our children, this ranch, this life, it's more than I ever dreamed possible. If I could go back and change anything, I wouldn't, because I might lose this." Tears glistened in Mara's eyes, but she was smiling. "I feel the same way. Even the hard parts, the loss and the fear, they were worth it because they brought us together." She leaned against him, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. As the new century approached, bringing with it changes and challenges neither of them could fully anticipate, Xavier and Mara faced it together, as they had faced everything since that fateful day in 1878. Their love had been forged in danger and tested by time, but it had only grown stronger, deeper, more essential with each passing year. The ranch that Mara had fought so hard to protect became a true family legacy, passed down through generations. The story of how Xavier and Mara met, how they had taken down a criminal operation and fallen in love in the process, became a family legend, told and retold to grandchildren and great-grandchildren. But for Xavier and Mara themselves, the story was simple. It was about two people who had found each other when they needed someone most, who had chosen to fight together rather than face their battles alone, and who had built a life of love and purpose on the wild Missouri prairie. It was a story of courage, determination, and the transformative power of love. It was their story, and it had the ending they had both always dreamed of, a happily ever after that lasted the rest of their long lives together.